الان go live.
اوكي
برينو بكون آره. Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Test 1, test 2, sound check, test 1, test 2.
Sep, can you hear me? Sep, can you hear me? Test, live stream test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Live stream test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll start momentarily.
Test 1, test 2, sound check, test 1, test 2.
Live stream will be started momentarily.
Okay, so what did you do then?
Thanks for your patience.
Okay, test 1, test 2. So it's clean for you? Okay, so it's clean.
1, 2, 3,
as long as it's clean.
5, 6, 7,
1,
8,
test 2, sound
9,
check.
10.
Test 1, test 2, test 1, test 2. Test, test, test. Test 1, test 2. Okay, so that'll work for you? Okay, that's the most important thing.
السلام عليكم. وينك؟ يا راجل قلت لك خذ الاوبر. من اول يا رجل لما انت تو ما تقول لي مخك وين طالع. انا خليت اوبر ما فيش طريقه اخرى. واشنطن لما تبي البنفيتس نتاعها you have to take an Uber. يا باركينج بروبلمز لا anything problems. ماشي خلاص انا شفتك دورت ما جيتكش قلت خليني كلمة.
Okay, just.
Morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 19th Annual Conference of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. My name is Asma Afsaruddin, and I'm the chair of the Board of Directors of CSID. As many of you know, our conference is a much anticipated annual event in Washington, D.C., which addresses critical topics of democracy and democratization in the context of various Muslim majority societies. The Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy is a non-profit institution studying Islamic and democratic political thought and merging them into a modern Islamic democratic discourse. The organization was founded in Washington, D.C. in March 1999 by a diverse group of academicians, professionals, and activists, both Muslim and non-Muslim, from around the USA, who agreed on the need for the study and dissemination of reliable information on this complex topic. We also now have a branch in Tunis, Tunisia, where CSID has been very active in promoting grassroots support for democracy among various sectors and maintains a very dynamic agenda of hosting lectures and symposia on Islamic democratic thoughts and practices and related matters. The title of our conference today is Authoritarianism and Democratic Decline in the Age of Sectarianism and Populism. These are topics that are very much on the front burner today. Sectarianism raises its ugly head in significant parts of the Middle East, while a tidal wave of populism sweeps through not only the MENA region, but also through much of Europe and the United States, leading many to wonder if this augurs the gradual erosion of liberal democratic values worldwide and the rise of a global trend of political authoritarianism. Our conference today will be exploring these fraught topics and reflecting upon where we are headed in such an age. Our first morning panel will focus on the topic of Egypt and the contradictions of liberalism. This will be followed by a panel on piety or politics, interpreting the Iran-Saudi rivalry and the rise of sectarianism. Next will be our luncheon keynote address to be given by the well-known Saudi columnist, activist, and author Jamal Khashoggi, who will be speaking on why the Arab world needs democracy now more than ever. An obviously timely as well as a provocative topic. This will be followed by a keynote panel that will focus on Turkey and is titled, Where is Turkey Headed? Assessing the State of Democracy in Turkey. Following the luncheon address and the keynote panel, we have an afternoon session on Tunisia called Challenges to Democratic Consolidation in Tunisia. Tunisia, of course, remains the one success story to have emerged out of the Arab Spring. Yet there remain significant challenges to the democratic processes that are underway there, challenges that will occupy the attention of our panelists. The late afternoon sessions in the 4 to 5 p.m. time slot are two parallel sessions. One is titled U.S. Foreign Policy, Neoliberalism, and the Pact Theory, and the other is Islamic Politics, Populism, and Coalition Building. We will then have concluding remarks by Dr. Radwan Masmoudi, the president of CSID, at the end of the day. Now to kick us off, I invite to the podium for making some introductory remarks the program committee chair for this year, Dr. Nader Hashmi, whose Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver is co-sponsoring this event with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 19th annual conference. Assalamu alaikum. Ahlan wa sahlan. Our Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver is very honored and proud to be co-sponsoring this conference. This is the third time that we are co-sponsoring a conference with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. And that's largely because the work that the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy has been pursuing overlaps almost exactly with the research focus of our academic center at the University of Denver, which is really to study the relationship between religion, democracy, and Muslim-majority societies. But of course, as we gather here to study the question of democracy in Muslim-majority societies, it's important to sort of just remind ourselves of the very dark, depressing, and really disappointing landscape that that sort of envelops this conversation about democracy in Muslim-majority societies. These are very dark and depressing times indeed. A few weeks ago, the Economist Intelligence Unit published its 10th edition of its Democracy Index, which is a comprehensive ranking of nations around the world that measures their commitment and progress towards democracy. And for the second consecutive year, the United States of America failed to be ranked in the top bracket as a full democracy and was grouped in the second category of flawed democracy. So one of the very challenging and disappointing aspects of having a conversation about democracy in the Arab and Islamic world is that while that region of the world has been a constant focus for this center and for the work that we do at the University of Denver, now we're confronted with the problem of global decline of democracy on a massive scale, including in this country. And it's not just the policies of Donald Trump that are of concern here. We're actually seeing a connection between the rise of authoritarianism in the West, linking up and reinforcing and strengthening authoritarian trends in the Arab Islamic world. And so when you survey the region that concerns us here, there's a lot to be depressed about. There's a lot to be angry about. But we soldier on. We want to continue to sort of talk about these issues, to continue to analyze these issues, because at the end of the day, this myth of authoritarian stability, this myth that somehow the interests of the West, the security of the West can be preserved by putting your faith in and trying to sustain authoritarian regimes is a recipe for greater disaster and disappointment. I mean, if there's one lesson to be learned from the Arab Spring is that if these authoritarian regimes were so successful and so able to preserve political order, they would not have erupted into revolutions to begin with. And so we're here to try and understand this particular topic in all of its dimensions. We have a number of excellent panels set up. We can't cover every single topic. Asma just went through some of the key panels. I have the honor of having a conversation at 11 o'clock to try and examine one of the key issues that I think is at the root of the instability in the region today, and that is the regional rivalry between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that seems to be heading us toward war in the coming months. And I look forward to having a conversation with our panelists. I just want to end by saying that we view this conference very much as a public group effort. In other words, each of the panels will have time reserved for audience questions and answers. So please take advantage of that opportunity to contribute to the conversations that we're having here up on the stage. We value your input. We look forward to your input. And we wish you all a very successful conference. Thank you all for coming. And I'll turn the floor over to Radwan for the transition to the next panel. Or should we just begin with the next panel? We'll begin with the next panel, which focuses on the topic of Egypt. And so we're very lucky to have the editors of a very important book with us here today, Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism. This is going to examine one of the most important countries in the Middle East. So I'll turn the floor over to Dalia Fahmy and Danish Farouki to start us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being up and awake so early in the morning. So our first panel covers Egypt. It's titled after a book that Danish and I co-edited but the scope of the panel goes far beyond that. And so I'm going to quickly introduce all of our panelists. They will speak in very broad context about several issues, and then for about 10 minutes each, and then we will open the floor to Q&A. So we're going to start off by my colleague, Danish Faruqi, who's a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers. He's a former Fulbright scholar in Morocco. He has over 5 years of combined experience living in the MENA region as a resident researcher and journalist, which gave rise to 2 books, Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism, with like the world's coolest co-editor. And the second, from Camp David to Cast-led, essays on Israel, Palestine, and the future of the peace process. He's presently based in Cairo, where his fieldwork focuses, Morocco, where his fieldwork focuses on the Syrian revolution and the role of transnational Sufi rebel groups in giving rise to the uprising. He's also a PhD candidate at Duke University. Our second speaker is Andrew Miller, who is the Deputy Director for Foreign Policy at the Project on Mideast Democracy and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has nearly 10 years of experience working on the Middle East for the US government and has conducted extensive research on multiple countries in the region. From 2014 to 2017, he served as the Director of Egypt and Israel on military issues on national security, where he was responsible for coordinating US policy towards each of these countries. While at the NSC, Andrew was deeply involved in the Obama administration's efforts to modernize US military assistance to Egypt. He's also participated as a member of the US delegation that negotiated a 10-year memorandum of understanding on security assistance to Israel, the largest aid agreement in US history. He's also worked at the Department of State on a variety of political and analytical roles, such as to the Middle East, serving at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and at the US embassies in Doha and Cairo. His latest article appears in Foreign Affairs on Egypt's sham elections. Our next speaker is Professor Amy Austin Holmes, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the American University of Cairo and a fellow here at the Wilson Center of International Center for Scholars. She's been awarded fellowships from Harvard, Brown, and was a Fulbright scholar in Germany. Her research focuses on the intersection of contentious politics and security issues. Her book, Social Unrest and American Military Bases in Turkey and Germany since 1945, was published by Cambridge University Press. Having spent a decade living in the Middle East through the period known as the Arab Spring, she's published numerous articles on Egypt, Turkey, Bahrain, and the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Syria. Her latest op-ed appeared 6 days ago in the Washington Post, asking what Egypt's racist campaign against the Nubians says about the Sisi regime. And finally, at the end of our panel, we have Mohammed al-Minshawi, who is a Washington-based foreign affairs columnist for Egypt's daily Al-Shuruq with a regular column. He previously held senior positions with a few Arab media outlets such as Al Arabi TV, Arab Insight, and Tahrir Washington. And for 4 years was a resident scholar at the Mideast Institute here in DC. His last piece was on Mohammed bin Salman's visit to the United States, which appeared in Al Jazeera, and he's testified at the Committee on Homeland Security covering Sinai. So as you can tell, we have a very dynamic panel who is well-versed on this issue, and we're going to begin with Danish Faruqi setting the stage for the conversation. He will speak for about 10 minutes. I'll give you a wave when it's time to stop, and then we'll move beyond that. Thanks again.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, first of all, to CSID for this opportunity for arranging this dynamic discussion. Thank you in advance for my distinguished colleagues. So insofar as this panel is titled Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism, it is at least loosely based on the book of the same title I published alongside Professor Fahmy a little over a year ago with considerable fanfare and success. which goes into great detail about the failures of Egyptian liberal activists and intellectuals in giving rise to the counter-revolution of 2013. But rather than offer an explication of the book's core thesis here, as Dali and I have done in lectures and talks all over the world over the past several months, I thought it astute today, in the aftermath of the latest presidential elections, to offer an impromptu afterword of sorts, sort of like, where are they now with regard to the illiberal intelligentsia that informed our intervention. To prepare for doing so, I did some considerable reading of thoughts and commentaries made by some key liberal figures in the election's aftermath, particularly in the Arabic language press. And despite these figures being disparate and unique in background, profession, and aims, I found some shocking unifying threads in their comportment. I'll start with Dr. Mohammed Abdul-Ghar, the physician activist and co-founder of the March 9th Movement for University Independence in Egypt. Briefly, as we articulated in our book, Dr. Abdul-Ghar transitioned from his role as founder of the Egyptian Social Democratic Party following the 2011 uprising to a stalwart supporter of President Sisi in the lead-up to and events following July 2013. Continuing to refer to Sisi as Egypt's redeemer in the years that followed, his criticisms of the president had been largely limited to economic concerns. In the aftermath of the latest presidential elections, though, Abdul-Ghar is eerily silent. In an article written in Al-Masri al-Yawm in the week leading up to the election, titled Al-Fan wa Tib am al-Intikhabat, the arts and medicine or the election, Abdul-Ghar goes as far as respond to his critics' frustration that he did not write about the elections as such. He responds stating that he would prefer to direct his prose to matters that actually stand to uplift the people of Egypt and increase the welfare of the country he so deeply loves, which in his view would be more appropriately channeled in the arts, spending the rest of his piece commenting on the Egyptian art scene in Dubai. Through their mastery of the arts, Abdul-Ghar maintains, the people of Egypt can take control over their own history and destiny. Essentially then, the good doctor relies on a red herring, waxing poetic about high culture in order to avoid taking meaningful responsibility for the very political moment he directly helped enable. We see the same in the case of the prominent writer and journalist Ibrahim Isa. Like Abdul-Ghar, one of the most avant-garde journalists in Egypt, has offered nothing by way of commentary on arguably the most important political moment in Egypt since 2013. Instead, he spent the election week dedicating his time to the work of the recently deceased Egyptian writer Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq, going as far as dedicating a full show of his radio program, in other words, to the life and career of the novelist. Additionally, he offers explications on Egyptian cinema during the election period. Now, to be fair, this isn't entirely outside of his job description as a media personality and an intellectual, but for an avowedly political journalist to refrain entirely from commenting on a key political moment facing the nation, a political moment he, in his commentary over the past several years, directly helped enable, suggests a breathtaking abdication of responsibility and dereliction of duty. From here, I'll move to Geber Asfour, the Egyptian novelist and cultural critic who forms a case study in one of our book's most intriguing chapters. Like Ibrahim Isa, Asfour spent part of the election week similarly expressing his sympathies at the passing of the novelist Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq. Now, this is less surprising for Asfour, whereas figures like Abdul-Ghar and Isa are palpably political figures. Asfour is first and foremost a litterateur, but it is his role as a cultural critic that, unlike his erstwhile colleagues, gives Geber Asfour rise to him making avowedly political explications. Keep in mind, Asfour was no armchair intellectual, but a former minister of culture, first under the stewardship of Ahmed Shafiq's transitional government in 2011, a role that he endured much rebuke at the time for accepting, and for which he resigned in 10 days, citing health concerns, and then again in 2014 and 2015 under President Sisi. Recent interviews in the lead-up to and aftermath of the 2018 elections have Asfour strongly emphasizing the cultural health of the nation and the need to radically overhaul education to help Egypt overcome the intellectual impasse facing its citizenry, in a project he, as Minister of Culture, tried to spearhead, which he termed Toward a New Cultural Paradigm. warning that Egypt is currently undergoing a difficult and heavy transitional phase. In a recent interview with Al-Masr al-Yawm, Asfour laments a lack of response from the government to properly support the resuscitation of Egyptian culture through media, the educational system, or otherwise. And in that context, in another interview, he actually goes as far as acknowledge the limitations of the electoral process, questioning why it did not have a series of competing candidates per a true democratic atmosphere. Yet despite acknowledging that degradation of the Egyptian democratic atmosphere, Asfour nonetheless acquiesces to precisely that degradation, maintaining that, quote, because of the exceptional circumstances in Egypt, we should postpone this request, that being of robust democratic elections, to the next presidency. Now, what are those exceptional circumstances to which Asfour speaks? As far as he is concerned, the imminent threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood to Egyptian society, particularly on Egyptian culture, necessitates that we presently excuse the erosion of the rule of law in Egypt, or at least postpone it until the threat of Islamism is first properly extirpated. So enduring is that threat, Asfour warns elsewhere that he rejected calls for reconciliation with the Brotherhood and its sympathizers on the premise that, quote, it is impossible to reconcile with those who killed my brother and son. Indeed, in his conversation with Al-Masr al-Yawm, Asfour admits having voted for Sisi in the latest election, trusting, quote, that Sisi will be able to change the situation. The man has made real achievements to which we should pay tribute, end quote. Those real achievements, however, have not to date sufficiently addressed investing in Egyptian culture in general or Asfour's project of toward a new cultural paradigm in particular. And so long as Sisi adequately makes these necessary investments in Egyptian high culture, it follows Asfour is willing to trust the president in his ongoing offensive on civil society. So here we see an interesting phenomenon in that Egyptian high culture is being offered as a subterfuge for avowedly political activists and commentators like Abul Ghar and Ibrahim Isa, whose careers would otherwise obligate them to weigh in the elections in some capacity. We see a retreat into cultural matters, quite literally in the case of Abul Ghar, as a stand-in for the political, hiding behind the exalted realm of the high arts to essentially elide their political commitments. Political commitments which, as our book astutely chronicles, directly help give rise to the current authoritarian order in place in Egypt. And on the flip side, we see politics being addressed more directly by cultural critics, who go so far as to rely on the same exalted status of Egyptian high culture as a basis to directly and unequivocally justify Sisi's repressive regime. In both cases, liberals under consideration have weaponized the lofty status of high culture in the arts, either to elide their responsibility in giving rise to the current political climate in Egypt, or to outright lend it their continuing support even 5 years later. At face value, then, it seems that liberals in Egypt have learned nothing since the elections of 2011 and 2013. An enduring reminder that, per the premises of our book, that their project remains deeply elitist and one mired in breathtaking contradictions at its inception, and that a viable liberal alternative in Egyptian politics will necessitate rethinking the project and its ultimate aims. Needless to say, even a year later, the contradictions of liberalism in Egypt continue to endure. With that, I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It looks like a very exciting panel with a lot of distinguished commentators and analysts and academics on affairs related to Islam and democracy. Danish did an excellent job of describing how the liberal intelligentsia had shaped an environment in which democracy and human rights were subverted in the March presidential election in Egypt. I'm going to build on that and try to assess what the implications of that election are for stability and Sisi's likely future within Egypt. As a disclaimer, this presentation is derived from my recent foreign affairs article, which Dahlia mentioned, and I co-drafted with Amy Hawthorne, my colleague at POMED, entitled Egypt's Sham Election, that ran in Foreign Affairs magazine in last month in March. So I'm going to make 5 points about the election and what it probably means for the stability of the regime and President Sisi in particular. The first point is that the ultimate outcome of the March presidential election in Egypt, in which Sisi won re-election with over 97% of the vote, does not provide a meaningful indicator popular support for his candidacy. Indeed, the election has been described accurately as a farce in which Sisi systematically eliminated all credible competitors to his re-election. We saw any number of candidates, both military and civilian, put under heavy pressure by the security services. Others were actually detained or arrested. The only opponent who made it into the election was a man named Mustafa Musa, who was an avowed supporter of Sisi's re-election. As little as 24 hours before he announced his candidacy at the last possible moment, he considered himself, or he labeled himself, the chair of Sisi's re-election campaign. And his Facebook page actually contained some graphics that supported Sisi's re-election. This is also an individual who is long suspected of having ties to the intelligence services. He likely played a role under the Mubarak regime in dividing the Al-Arad party of Ayman Noor at the behest of the security services. The political bankruptcy of this election was reflected in the lack of public enthusiasm. There was a reported turnout of 41%, which was lower than the 47% in 2014 and about 50% in 2012. However, the likely turnout was probably much lower. Most of the polling stations at the conclusion of the second of 3 days of balloting indicated they had turnout of around 20%. It's highly unlikely that 25% of the Egyptian electorate turned out in a single day. So in all likelihood, the turnout was probably less than 30%, which marks a major decline in participation in Egyptian presidential elections, and again reveals that this election very much was a farce. It was a sham. It didn't provide a meaningful outlet for Egyptians to express their political preferences. The second point is, although the outcome of the election itself was not a meaningful indicator of Sisi's public standing, the way in which he managed it does provide some important hints about his position within the country and how he views his ability to control the country moving forward. In particular, he ratcheted up repression and angrily and ruthlessly quashed military-linked candidates. This demonstrates the degree to which his power is dependent on the military's continued loyalty, or at least its acquiescence. What we saw is at least two significant military competitors in Ahmed Shafiq, who was referenced in Danish's presentation, and Sami Anan, the former Armed Forces Chief of Staff, stepped forward. They were both pushed out of the election. In the case of Shafiq, he was detained in a hotel in Cairo for a number of days, and pressure was put on his daughters, who were essentially hostages in Abu Dhabi. So there was a deliberate attempt to move him out of the campaign. When Sami Anan, the chief of staff, announced his candidacy, he was almost instantaneously arrested. He still remains in military prison, although some of the charges have been dropped, and it's unclear how much longer he's actually going to remain in prison. But what we saw with these military candidates is this was the first instance of discontent within the Egyptian military turning into outright dissent, where you had senior members of the armed forces, retired or active, actually posing a challenge to Sisi's control and power. We saw this discontent going back several years. In fact, as early as 2014, we saw purges in which military officers from junior to senior were reportedly pushed out because of their supposed opposition to President Sisi. We saw opposition within the military to the controversial deal Sisi negotiated with Saudi Arabia to turn over two Red Sea islands. And in fact, in this regard, both the defense minister, Sedki Sopi, and the, at the time, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Mahmoud Ghazi, who is a family relation of Sisi's, are known to have opposed that decision. And even more recently, before the elections, Ghazi, who I mentioned is a familial relation, was forced out of his position and placed under house arrest, reportedly because he disagreed with Sisi's management of the security situation. So there was clearly some level of discontent within the Egyptian military. With this election, it came out into the open, and Sisi's reaction was furious. On January 31st, he attended a ceremony inaugurating the Zohr gas field in northern, off the coast of Egypt. The speech took place in northern Egypt. and he angrily denounced opposition to him within the country, and staring menacingly at the defense minister, said he would not allow another scenario like 2011 to repeat itself. So it's clear that he was spooked by what was taking place, and that he suspected that elements of the military were responsible for challenges to his position. The third point is that moving forward, because Sisi is so dependent on the military, his survival will likely depend on whether he can keep the perceived cost of his removal to be higher than the perceived cost of his remaining in power. Some of the costs of removal are primarily revolve around the uncertainty associated with trying to find another candidate, a perceived lack of alternatives, although the emergence of Annan and Shafiq put the lie to that to some degree. Some of the costs of continuing to support Sisi is that the military's reputation could suffer damage if they're perceived as being so out of step with the public at large. The military in Egypt is a risk-averse institution. They're very conservative, and they're probably going to be reluctant to act against one of their own. But as we saw in 2011, there are circumstances in which the military could be compelled to take action. Above all else, the military fears chaos. And if they determine that Sisi is either contributing to disorder in the country or he cannot prevent the emergence of disorder, his position could become untenable. The fourth point concerns what specific conditions might lead the military to take action against Sisi. And it's very possible that Sisi's position will hinge on the military's view of his management of two challenges. One, the economy, and two, the security situation in the country. Should either issue threaten to strain military cohesion in particular, by which I mean the armed forces' unity of purpose and respect for the authority of the senior leadership, senior leaders may be even more inclined to take drastic steps of forcing Sisi out. It's no secret that the Egyptian economy is in difficult straits. Sisi has undertaken a number of reforms at the recommendation of the IMF to stabilize the economy, but it remains to be seen whether these measures that are probably producing some degree of aggregate economic growth can be translated into better living conditions for most Egyptians. And if he's unable to improve the living conditions of most Egyptians, we could very well see mass protests or civil disobedience that would put pressure on the military to take action. It's important to recognize that in Egypt now, you have over 30% of the population living in poverty. The official unemployment rate is below 12%. However, the estimate is that youth unemployment is 33%. Inflation remains high. It's over 13%. It was as high as over 30% in recent months. The situation is particularly troublesome, and the Egyptians who are least capable of withstanding these circumstances are the ones who have suffered the most. If Sisi is unable to reverse this trend, if he's unable to deliver inclusive economic growth, the military may be forced to come out in the event of some type of popular disturbances. Second, regarding the security situation, again, it's well known that the situation in the Sinai is particularly dodgy, and we have this ongoing Egyptian military campaign there. It's unclear what progress it's made, although if you're looking at past instances of Egyptian military deployments to Sinai, any progress has been relatively short-lived. What's important to understand is that what takes place within the Sinai is probably not the most important security challenge for Sisi. To some degree, if he can merely contain what's taking place within the peninsula, it's probably not going to pose a threat to his regime. However, if this security threat metastasizes and emerges in the Nile Delta in the Egyptian heartland, that could potentially pose a threat to his standing. The military, it has to be recognized, above all else, is responsible for providing security. It is their raison d'etre. And if it's perceived that the Sisi regime is not capable of providing that security, if there are major terrorist attacks in Cairo, in Nile Delta cities, like we've seen recently attacks on Coptic Christian churches, we saw a major attack at a mosque in the Sinai, but if that takes place west of the Suez Canal, that could lead to a perception within the Egyptian military that Sisi's become a liability, and they may have to act out from that point. And what's perhaps most concerning is that beyond the threat posed by ISIS, we've also seen additional organizations emerge that pose a threat, many of which are believed to be populated by ex-members of the Muslim Brotherhood who left the organization primarily because they disagreed with the group's peaceful, gradualist approach to politics and sought a more violent means of achieving the political objectives that they continue to share with many other organizations. So it'll be important to watch out, either by protests forcing the military to come out or some type of palace coup. There is the risk that there could be some type of threat to Sisi emanating from the military. The final point I'll make is that in terms of the most immediate threats and the playing field that we're turning to with the elections past us, a lot of attention has been focused on constitutional amendments, that Sisi is going to try to change the Constitution either to extend his term, remove term limits, or strengthen his power. And I agree that's going to be an important indicator of his support. If he can push through those changes, it probably suggests a degree of military cohesion that will put him in good stead. However, even if he moves past that challenge, even if he's successful in delivering those constitutional amendments, we have to watch out for potential externalities over which, by definition, Sisi has little control, such as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam or a global economic downturn, either of which could destabilize Egypt and undermine Sisi's standing within the country. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam could begin filling soon, and there are some estimates that it could reduce water flow to Egypt by as much as 25%. And Egypt gets roughly 50% of its electricity from hydropower. So this would have consequences not just for drinking water and for agriculture, but potentially for economic activity throughout the country. That's something to watch, and there's growing concern that the Egyptians are not going to be able to prevent it from moving forward. The foreign minister issued a rather truculent statement recently saying that Egypt is willing to resort to all means in order to protect its water share. So that's an alarming development. In terms of the economy, the global economy has been doing fairly well. It's not spectacular, but it's chugging along. If there were another global recession like we saw at the end of the last decade, Egypt is particularly vulnerable to shocks in the global economic framework. So even if Sisi plays the economy perfectly, even if he begins to deliver improvements to living conditions, a global economic downturn can undercut everything he's achieved and plunge the country into chaos. So what this points out is not only is Sisi perhaps undermining his position by unforced errors, but there are also things beyond his control, these externalities that could potentially jeopardize his ability to stay on. In short, Sisi's ability to serve a term commensurate with that of Mubarak seems unlikely at this point, but we'll ultimately only figure that out depending on how he and the degree to which he consolidates the regime. Thank you.
And next we have Amy Austin Holmes.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation and to CSID for organizing this conference. I'm going to, my presentation will complement the two excellent presentations we've just heard that focused on the military and the cultural elite in a way, because I'm going to try to focus on the issue of civil society. So I'm going to look more at the ground level, what's been happening in terms of what I see as one of President Sisi's primary objectives during his first 4 years as president was actually to, fundamentally change the nature of state-society relations in Egypt. And if he succeeds in doing this, this would fundamentally alter the nature of the regime. Rigging elections or sham elections, eliminating political rivals, these are things we've seen before in Egypt under Mubarak and also under, in other authoritarian countries in the region and elsewhere in the world. So, rigging elections or eliminating your political rivals, these are not necessarily new strategies in the autocrat's handbook, as we all know. However, I do actually think that what Sisi is trying to do in terms of crushing independent civil society is actually new. Because under Mubarak, we actually saw that, Mubarak allowed NGOs, civil society initiatives, to some extent even social movements to exist. They were sometimes harassed, they sometimes were shut down, they sometimes, got arrested. But actually we saw a proliferation in the number of non-governmental organizations, particularly during the last 10 years of Mubarak's rule. Now, according to the Ministry of Social Solidarity, there are some, over 30,000 NGOs registered in Egypt. Of course, many of those may be, shell organizations, but the point is that there was actually a proliferation of independent groups within civil society that were not under the control of the state. These ranged from, human rights organizations that were very critical of the regime, like the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, or the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, or Nazra for Feminist Studies, but also, cultural initiatives, youth initiatives, charities, etc. Now, one of the things that Sisi has tried to do during his first 4 years in power as president is to make it very difficult for civil societies to exist independent of the government. And this has often been discussed here in the United States as, under the context or the headline of the NGO law. But I would argue that this NGO law, if you read it, it's already very draconian, because the actual, law basically says that, NGOs can only operate within the scope of the state's plans. But what I am going to try to convince you of today is that even those organizations that do operate entirely within the scope of the state's plans, that, for example, are only asking for rights that are already in the Egyptian constitution, they are being harassed, imprisoned, arrested, and shut down. So even those organizations that are entirely within the scope of the state's plans, that are entirely constitutional and only asking for their constitutional rights, even they are being harassed and persecuted. Now, I've been teaching at the American University in Cairo since 2008, and over the past year and a half or so, I've been conducting a research project on the crackdown on civil society. And one of the things I wanted to do as the director of this research project was to travel outside Cairo, because a lot of the reporting that we hear about what happens in Egypt really focuses only on Cairo and perhaps Alexandria. Egypt, of course, is a country of 100 million people. Approximately 80 million of those people do not live in Cairo. And so if we only look at those organizations in Cairo, we really don't understand what's happening elsewhere in the country. So I'm just going to very briefly highlight a few of the findings from this research project, where we traveled from Alexandria in the north to Aswan in the south, Minya, Asyut, Ina, Mahalla, Tanta, Mansoura, to really try to understand what was happening in Egypt, outside of the capital. Now, these articles are going to be published starting next week in early May with the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and there's a sign-up sheet. If you're interested to get those articles, please just sign up on the sign-up sheet, and you'll receive the email notification. So we're going to be publishing 5 articles. One will focus on the crackdown on women's organizations. One will focus on the crackdown on Coptic Christian associations. One will focus on organizations that work with workers in state-owned companies, privately owned companies, and military-owned companies. Another will be a comparison of Ina and Asyut, and comparing the legacies of tribalism and terrorism, because the Gamma al-Islamiyya was very strong in Asyut in the past, and how this legacy has sort of structured state-society relations in Asyut, compared to Ina. And then finally, an article on the Nubian Minority. So I've just prepared a few slides if you would like to, So just very briefly, just to give you one example of how, the women's movement in Egypt actually, has been it predates the human rights organization, right? So there's been a feminist organization movements in Egypt since the early 20th century. And those organizations range from very radical feminist organizations to sort of reformist organizations to those that are more allied with the regime. But this is just one example of a small women's initiative in Minya that is advocating to uphold the existing laws on underage marriage in Egypt, because Egypt prohibits underage marriage. So this is an organization that is not challenging the regime, right? They're only asking for Egypt's own laws to be upheld on underage marriage, or child marriage, right? But instead of the regime seeing an organization like this as a partner that is actually, in a way, doing its work for them, right? Because, in fact, the government should be upholding these laws on underage marriage or that prohibit child marriage. But they don't. And so you have these civil society organizations that are trying to raise awareness in rural areas regarding child marriage or underage marriage. And so they're not, they're not challenging the government. They're, in fact, trying to, allow these laws and good governance to be, to spread into rural areas. And yet even organizations like this are being harassed. They're not able to receive funding. They're being accused of receiving foreign funding and being part of a foreign agenda, although again, these are Egypt's own laws, okay? Another article will focus on if you could go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, the Coptic Christian minority. Here is an example of a Coptic Christian association that, for example, promotes understanding between the Coptic Christian minority and the Muslim population. So they're basically trying to combat sectarianism, right? Again, this is not something that is challenging the regime or criticizing the regime, but is actually, you would think, doing something that the regime might appreciate, because they're trying to, essentially promote peaceful coexistence between Copts and Muslims. And yet they too are facing persecution and being not able to do their work, to implement their activities, their neighborhood activities. Can you go to the next slide, please? A third article is going to look at the organizations that work with workers in, as I mentioned, 3 different types of factories. And some of these workers have been merely advocating for existing court decisions to be upheld regarding the payment of their wages or their bonuses. Again, nothing that's actually changed at challenging the regime, just asking for the implementation of a court order regarding the payment of their bonuses. And this is the branch office in Alexandria of the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, which had been helping and promoting awareness amongst working class Egyptians. They had essentially suspended their activities in January 2017 because of this NGO law. Could you go to the next slide, please? And finally, the Nubian minority is going to be the focus of another article. These are images here of the Nuba Association in Aswan, and then the slide to your right is from Nasr Nuba. Nasr Nuba is a village where Nubians were forcibly displaced at the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, when the Aswan High Dam was built. Now, I made a trip to Aswan and also to this village where they were forcibly displaced at the time of Nasser as part of this research. And one of the things that the new constitution, actually in 2014, has included for the first time is a reference to Nubia. Could you go to the next slide, please? Now, Article 236, again, this is the post-coup constitution, the 2014 constitution, that on paper looks a bit more progressive than the constitution that existed prior to that, right, under Mohamed Morsi and prior to that. So, again, one of the things that was introduced in this constitution was Article 236, which gives Nubians the right to return to some of the land from which they were forcibly displaced at the time of Nasser.
Yes.
So, there was a small and entirely peaceful protest in Aswan on September 3rd of 2017. About 24 Nubians were arrested, they were imprisoned and kept at a facility run by the Central Security Forces in Aswan. One of those people was Gamal Surur, who was the president of the General Nubian Union in France. He's an Egyptian citizen. He has spent time living in France, however, he maintained his Egyptian citizenship. He was known for his philanthropy, for his support of the Nubians, and also for his peaceful advocacy of Nubian rights. After over 2 months in detention, he died. of medical neglect. The prison authorities had been refusing to provide him his diabetes medication. He'd fallen into a diabetic coma more than once, and then he died on November 5th. They were all kept in the same prison cell, the 24 detainees, and they were not even given beds to sleep on. So after Mr. Sarur died, the other detainees were released. However, they were not acquitted. And so this case has been dragging on since September. It's become so controversial. It's known as the detainees of Dufuf because they were playing a traditional Nubian instrument like a tambourine, a Dufuf instrument, is what it's referred to in Arabic. And they now, a judge recently recused himself. Now, we don't know why he recused himself, of course, but it's possible that he was being put under pressure to issue a verdict, to send them back to prison. I don't know. There was something that, for some reason, he recused himself. And now, instead of investigating the death of Gamal Sarur, the state-controlled media launched a media campaign, a defamation campaign against the surviving members of other surviving detainees from this particular case, including the president of the General Nubian Union in Austria. If you could go to the next slide, please. So these were 10 articles published on the same day with the same content on April 1st. This was one day before Sisi was announced that he had won the elections. One day. So, of course, you know, it seems as if this was timed because of Sisi's re-election and also because of this upcoming court case. So this is an example of Tamer Abdelmonem, who's, you know, as a talk show host. He was revealing the secrets of the meddlers, the manipulators, and internationalizing the Nubian issue. I was mentioned in 6 or 7 of those 10 articles because of my research. And that trip that I made to Nasr Nuba, this village, which I just showed you. So clearly, this is it's an attempt to delegitimize these entirely peaceful Nubian human rights defenders by claiming they have contacts to foreigners, such as myself. And also it's an attack on academic freedom. Those of you who've been following Egypt are familiar, I'm sure, with the case of Ahmad Shaheen, who was sentenced to death in a farcical trial. He was a colleague of mine at AUC in 2015. Julu Rajani was disappeared in 2016 and found in a ditch with signs of torture on his body. So this is worrying that this campaign has been launched now. And in fact, if you could go to the next slide, please. I just have 2 more slides to show you that this is truly a form of incitement against these Nubian human rights defenders. This is Hamdi Suleiman, the president of the General Nubian Union in Austria. So his picture is you know, his picture, his full name are mentioned in these articles in the state-controlled media. And it's truly a form of incitement against them. If you could go to the next slide. This is another example. This is Mohammed Azmi, the former president of the General Nubian Union in Egypt, who was arrested along with Gamal Sarur and others. And the next slide. So there, you know, as I said, there are about 10 articles published on the same day with the same content, most likely under instructions from security services, intelligence services. As Dalia had mentioned, I did write an op-ed about this. In the Washington Post last week, there are a few copies on the tables, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. The next court date for these Nubian human rights defenders is May 20. Thank you.
And last but definitely not least,
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I will take advantage of being the only Egyptian in the panel to speak about the foreign factor and mainly Southern Directories, about the US and the Egypt transition or non-transition. And I will focus more about the military-to-military relation and how it affects negatively the transition for democracy in Egypt. And I will try to avoid what they mentioned about the internal Egyptian politics. I will jump to the US dimension, and quickly I will remind everyone how the relation came to exist after the October War of 1973, when Egypt have dramatic change of its direction from Soviet Eastern Bloc alienation towards the Western American camp. And that was started in 1972 by expelling the thousands of Russian experts and military people in Egypt for no price, actually, at that time. But with the peace with Israel in 1973, Egypt and the United States have reached an equation, a simple one, I believe, aid for cooperation. And Egypt was cornerstone for US strategy in the region. And Egypt was big and have soft power and influence in the region. And the US took advantage of that to force or to push our countries to more peace treaties with Israel, and successfully they did achieve it with Jordan and to some extent some Palestinians. And US always claims there is contradiction, or US circles in DC between interest and values in terms of US-American relation, but I believe interest always won. I would claim they mentioned that even till now, because of the moral and ethical dilemma and guilt they feel, but always interest win over the value and such beautiful words. 9/11 was a very transforming moment of the bilateral relation between Egypt and the United States. It doesn't become strategic as before, because the US oriented its foreign policy, and Egypt no exception here, toward counterterrorism. And it was all about what's the root of terrorism and the debate here, and we remember all Condi Rice, 60 years of supporting dictators, reduced 9/11, so let's go for freedom agenda policy, or they claimed freedom agenda, but this was quickly failed with the outcomes of free elections in the Arab world, not only Egypt, when Islamists won in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Egypt, and Tunisia, and Morocco, so it was reversed. And in these years was ups and downs of the Egyptian-American relation, but the strategic nature of it, especially military-to-military relation, was always stable. Some screaming about repression of the regime to some activists like Saadin Ibrahim or others, but always strategic. And Obama visited Cairo in 2009 to deliver a speech to the Muslim world, and it was a recognition of the role of Egypt and how important was it. And an interesting date happened, which is the revolution of 25th of January, and US was confused, it doesn't know what to do, but it called for everything except removing Mubarak. They dared to say orderly transition, and it meant accepting the second man of the regime then, which General Omar Suleiman, the head of Egyptian intelligence, to succeed Mubarak, and that was, of course, rejected by millions of Egyptians in the street, and the US goal of orderly transition failed, and it was a wake-up call to them, because what they perceived to understand in Egyptian politics and the Egyptian mindset was completely false. Moving quickly to the moment of the coup of July 3rd, US lost any leverage they have or they claim to have when they don't call it a coup in the night of the July 3rd, 2013. They thought afterward we can influence the behavior of the Egyptian military, and it was false claim from Washington. They called the action is not acceptable, they freeze some aid, and they called for inclusive democracy and transition. That's a phrase used by Obama personally and his team, inclusive democracy, inclusive transition, which meant then for the military to include Muslim Brotherhood in any future planning for transition Egypt, which completely false. And if you know Egypt and the Egyptian military, you will laugh of this claim or call from Washington to be inclusive, to Egyptian regime to be inclusive and including Muslim Brotherhood in the way forward. And they freeze the aid, which was big slap to Egyptian military. They never expected Washington to do that. They take the aid. I'll talk about military aid. The economic aid is not worth talking about, really. It's all about military. And they took it for granted, the Egyptian military, because they think they are doing a great job to American interests in the region. Though during Mubarak era, there is a lot of reports about how Washington tried to pressure Egyptian military doctrine to be changed from being oriented toward Israel as the enemy and not having this traditional weapon like F-16 and tanks and warfare in open space, to have it more counterterrorism doctrine, which they succeeded only after the coup to change this doctrine of Egyptian military fighting theme. They freeze the aid for 7-8 months. They resumed it back in April 2014 for no reason. When I asked some officials, Andrew's colleague and other people in the State Department, you freeze the aid after the massacre of Rabaa, you resume it back in April. What happened? What Egyptians did in order to resume the aid back? And the answer was nothing. Because really they didn't provide anything to pressure Washington or to seduce Washington to resume the aid. But the US resumed it for no return on the other side. Inclusive democracy doesn't happen. Repression was all-time high, as we know. Yet I claim Washington resumed the aid with new conditions, with new nature of the military aid, to achieve its strategic goal of reorientation of the military of Egypt, the military doctrine, not to be conventional open warfare against Israel, but to be counterterrorism-oriented military. And that's obviously in the declaration of resuming the aid. 4 points US was giving Egypt the aid based on: first, Sinai; second, counterterrorism; third, maritime security; and fourth one is border control. So nothing to do with the classic warfare Egyptian military was based on, which countered Israel. And they adopted a new tactic, which no more cash flow. US aid was based on cash flow. They gave Egyptian advantage of buying big ticket items like F-16 and others, but the resuming of aid was stopped that from 2018, so Egyptian can't buy big item anymore from the United States based on this philosophy of or tactic of cash flow. And that achieved as well strategic achievement for US not to allow Egyptian military to be conventional, to get this big item which they don't need. For counterterrorism, why you need F-16? That's Washington claim. And at the same time was new word introduced in Washington for the Egyptian military is the biggest Sunni army. That's never been used. Egyptian, if you ask them, the military is Sunni, they don't know what that's about, but it was used in a lot of circles here in Washington. That's the largest Sunni army, and that was very alarming in Cairo, because that means we have Sunni Shia conflict, and that's not welcomed in Cairo. And at the same time, after resuming the aid, Egypt was not so important in the Middle East troubling map, as we see ISIS and so Egypt was very much marginalized of the serious discussion in Washington. And of course, the terrorism in Sinai was a factor, so Egypt was not able to deliver because of the economic difficulties after the coup and after the revolution, and the Sinai thing. So it was not a big player in the region, and sadly it became dominated by Saudi, by Emirati, Israeli, by Turkey, by Iranian, but not Egyptian anymore. And that gave good reason for the regime to be more repressive, extremely repressive, and it works so far. I believe it's very stable, no existential threat, besides being not active in some aspect, but there's no existential threat domestically or internationally. And the Sisi image and its regime here in Washington is good too. Of course, there is a lobby of NGOs and rights group which always criticizing whoever in Egypt, Mubarak, Morsi, Sisi, but it's always marginalized, and small people in Congress, a few people in Congress here and there. But Sisi's lobbying is doing great here because it's not only Egyptian lobby, it's Israeli and Emirati and Saudi as well, so it's very easy target. And they sell good points. Egypt is signed the deal with IMF and the World Bank, and this said it's very encouraging and it's very daring, and they ask other countries to follow Egyptian model of reform economically. Sisi was able to sell falsely, of course, the phrase religious revolution or religious freedom, Islamic freedom, which of course we know is false claim, but it sells well in a lot of circles here in Washington. And of course, the war on terrorism is always welcomed news for Republicans and other people here in Washington. Jumping quickly to Egypt foreign policy, and I observe, and others as well, it's done in secret. Of course, Sisi is intelligent guy from, not intelligent, I mean from the military intelligence unit, and his top aides is from military intelligence as well, and they conduct business in secrecy. We don't know, I will think, what's happening with Egypt military relation with Russia. Does Russia have base in Egypt? Do they ship arms to Egypt? I don't know, but there's reports about it. Egypt relation with North Korea, we know there is something, but we don't know if they comply with US demand to shut the military relation with North Korea. They do it in secret. I don't know if they have military attaché in Cairo or in Pyongyang. I have no clue because they do it in secrecy and they ask Egyptian officials no answer. Sinai is secret policy making, of course. No access to journalists, domestic or foreigner. We don't know what's really going in Sinai besides the statement from the Ministry of Defense, which I will not take it as face value. Egypt decision to hand 2 islands to Saudi Arabia, done in secrecy as well. We don't know the debate in terms of the military establishment, what happened, who agreed, who not, if it was good or bad, we don't know, it's secrecy as well. And I will say, last month Egypt signed military agreement with United States called STISMO. It's communication and security agreement of memorandum of agreement, never approved under Mubarak regime or Morsi or Skafi even, but they signed it last month and we don't know what's in it, what's allow US to do or access in Egyptian territory. And of course there's Egyptian nuclear, civilian nuclear reactor in Daba, in northern coast. It's with Russia. We don't know what's in there because there's a loan of $35 billion from Russia, and Russia is not so rich country to give to Egyptians, so don't know the details. It's all done in secrecy. So it's a lot of question mark about Egypt conducting its foreign policy because of the nature of the regime and then Sisi person. And I will end with one question. Is a lot of people claiming Egypt is too big to fall, too big country, 100 million people, and have big weight and end. However, I believe it won't fail, I see, but because there is no threat. Extreme repression sadly working, no pressure from any foreign power. US doesn't have the will to pressure Egyptian military to be more opening and because there is no interest. Egypt democracy is not US interest, never been and will never have, and every Egyptian kid understands that Sisi will be president forever and he will never be former president, and we will see what Washington will do, will accept it, and the circle will be repeated again. Sisi will stay maybe decades, Mubarak stayed 30 years, no Egyptian expected that, but he did, and unfortunately that maybe will be the scenario with Sisi. Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes for Q&A. I have a mic here, so if you have any questions, you have a mic too. All right. Maybe we can take 3 or 4 and then have the panelists answer them all together because we don't have too much time left. Is that okay? Okay. It's on.
My name is Hammond, and I have quick questions to Andrew and to Amy as well. To Andrew, who is, in your opinion, the most influential in terms of influencing Sisi's decision? Is it Israel, or Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, or the US at this point, from your survey of these last 4 or 5 years? And to Amy, I understand that you focused your research on NGO inside Egypt. How about the Egyptian NGOs in the diaspora? Have you thought of reaching out, because they are also receiving the same harassment from the regime everywhere? The worst, of course, is the new law to repeal their citizenship. Am I asking that as well?
We're going to take a few questions.
My question is for Amy also. We know specifically with AUC that there's been problems with the case of Giuliani and et cetera. I'm wondering how you are safe and how your team is safe. I had a project that I was working on, asking questions, survey questions to faculty and grad students at Al-Azhar, and that, stopped dead in its track. It was together with a colleague at Harvard, and we both forgot about the project because people were hesitant to respond to those questions. Thank you.
Can I ask, it was stopped by who? Can I ask?
Jocelyn Cesari.
Sorry?
Jocelyn Cesari and myself.
Who stopped the project?
The people were just very afraid of responding. The graduate students and the faculty were very afraid of responding to the questions.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. My question is to Andrew and anybody else who wants to address it. You mentioned that if Sisi is not able to maintain order, faces a challenge. And I think what you said was that maybe the military will push him out and there'll be a replacement. Now, there's a learning curve here, is that, okay, we won't do what we did last time. So do you think that there is a possibility that when that happens, in the next sort of intervention by the military, that there will be more room to deal with legitimate civilian actors willing to do business with the state?
We have one more question.
Hammond, Voice of America. In talking about the contradiction between liberals in Egypt and how they are not doing enough, I didn't see any mention of the culture of fear, which is preventing activists from doing their role. So I would like to ask, what are the requirements for these people to be active within the constraints of the government and security apparatus?
And I'm going to take liberty and ask a question as well. So every panelist has talked about this moment where the current administration or the current regime is going to become a liability, just like Mubarak was a liability at some point and Morsi became a liability. And we're seeing a trend where if Egypt becomes either ungovernable or economically or socially unstable, that we're going to have this crisis mode. And we're starting to see fissures within the military and also possibly within the State Department, a lack of trust of where this is heading. And so my question is, at what point, or what is the moment with which intervention and real rethinking can happen? Because civil society can't continue to be crushed. The military fissures are growing, and US foreign policy interest towards Egypt is changing with a country that is not really articulating the counter narrative that we're used to. So at what point does the fissure lead to a moment of it's become a liability for everyone and change has to happen? And so I'll let you answer whatever you want to answer and then maybe include some concluding remarks because we only have a few minutes left. Thanks.
Just quickly, for your question, sir. I believe Sisi learned a lesson from Mubarak. During Mubarak, there was an institution that doesn't exist today called the presidency. The military was away in the back, doing its own business. Nobody touched what he's doing or interfere, even the president himself. And there was a presidency, like the executive office here, Mubarak and his top aide, and that was a space between him as the head of the state and the military establishment. Therefore, when the moment of 2011 happened, it was easy to get rid of him as being liability for them. But now, Sisi learned from that experience, in my opinion, don't create any distance between you, meaning the president, and the military establishment. It's almost the same thing. He is ruling directly by the military. He doesn't allow anything to be between them. He is in uniform a few times after being the president, and no space between him and the military establishment. The space was filled by Gamal Mubarak, for example, before the revolution, and his people. There was a space. Nowadays, there is no space between him and the military establishment. He is the military establishment. The military establishment is him. So to get rid of him, I believe it is very unlikely under any circumstances. Maybe there will be internal debate between them. We don't know what's happening in the military establishment in the top of it because it's really black box. Maybe they have an agreement to replace him or for him to stay for years, or we don't know. But there's no space to work and create a fraction between him and the military establishment. He doesn't allow that to happen.
So as to your question, I have, of course, spoken to Egyptians outside Egypt in the diaspora, but for this particular project, we focused on NGOs and civil society associations within Egypt, and again, primarily focusing on, outside Cairo, because again, this is where 80 million Egyptians live, and their livelihood, to some extent, depended on, associations, charities, the provision of the types of, public goods that they provided, and whether it be, raising awareness about, basic issues regarding, underage marriage or their constitutional rights or their rights as citizens, and if those organizations cannot operate, I think, this is a true problem, and the problem is that the regime even sees those who are upholding existing laws as the enemy. I mean, they don't just view, the Muslim Brotherhood or the jihadis in the Sinai as the enemy, but even these organizations that are working within the scope of the draconian laws. And if those people cannot work, for me, this is not a tenable situation, and I don't know. Of course, I can't predict any time when there might be a tipping point, but it is I think also a major difference to Mubarak. And as to your question regarding our research, my research project was entirely approved through the American University in Cairo. I received IRB approval through the American University in Cairo. Our travel throughout Egypt was approved through the AUC travel office. So, AUC is still, I believe, one of the few universities where we have some academic freedom within the university. One of the first things Sisi did after he became president, as I'm sure you know, is he gave himself the power to appoint not only every president of every public university in Egypt, but also every dean of every faculty in every public university throughout the country. Now, since the American University in Cairo is a private university, we're not subject to that. But of course, I mean, as Imad Shaheen, Julio Rejeni, Imad Shaheen is a professor, a colleague of mine at AUC. Julio Rejeni was doing his PhD at Cambridge, but he has a visiting affiliation with AUC. So of course, even we, although we are more protected at AUC than other universities in Egypt, of course, we also feel under attack. So it is, it is indeed a very worrying situation, which is what I was trying to draw attention to in this op-ed that I wrote last week, among other things.
First, regarding which country or countries have the most influence over Egypt, influence is difficult to measure, and part of the problem is, I think, there is the expectations for how influence plays out are misplaced. It's not short term. There's no single country that can simply dictate terms to Egypt and elicit immediate response. I think any of the countries you mentioned, Egypt, or Israel, Saudi Arabia, even the United States, if they're prepared to sustain pressure on the Egyptians for an extended period of time, it is possible to secure some type of concessions or gains in return. However, Sisi is particularly adept at playing countries off of each other. And what that means is when the United States is trying to pressure Egypt, but Israel and Saudi Arabia are undercutting that pressure, Sisi has been able to deflect the need to undertake steps to address American concerns. The same thing would play out if the Israelis were trying to pressure the Egyptians on something, but Egypt could turn to the US or Saudi Arabia or Russia for what they're losing from Israeli cooperation. Again, that doesn't mean that influence is impossible, but I think the ingredients for success are, one, it has to be sustained and there needs to be a realistic assumption about how long it will take to achieve progress, and two, the pressure is going to be more effective if it is coordinated across multiple countries. So a united front is put forward that Egypt can't simply turn against each other. There is a divide and conquer approach, and that needs to be recognized in devising any type of strategy to deal with the Egyptians, particularly when you want them to do something they're not inclined to do themselves. Two, in terms of what the military learn. I mean, the military is not a democratic institution. The military is not a human rights-friendly organization. As amazing as it seems, both in 2011 and 2013, there were major parts of the U.S. government that were indulging fantasies that the military was a neutral arbiter and they were simply going to carry out the wishes of the population and they wouldn't seek to impose their views or impose their culture on the rest of the country. Obviously that's ridiculous, and obviously that was proved wrong in each case. And I don't think the military as an institution has changed. However, I think there are some individuals within the military who might be more willing to at least gesture in a direction of more inclusiveness. If you look at what both Anand and Shafiq said when they were campaigning for president, they were reading talking points from civilian platforms. Whether they would have acted on them if they were elected remains to be seen. But nevertheless, the fact that they were even mentioning those things seemed to indicate that they understood there was a need for a broader coalition with civilians. There was a need to encourage them to play a greater role. But ultimately, if civilians do assume the rightful place within Egypt, it's probably not going to be because the military gave it to them. It's either because the civilians become better organized, they learn from their past mistakes in trying to compete with the military for influence and do so more effectively, or the military makes a mistake and they unintentionally create an opening for the civilians to come forward. So in that sense, I don't think we should have any faith that even if Sisi's removed, the military is going to act in such a way as to promote democracy or human rights, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be opportunities. We just need to be realistic about the probability of that. And then in relation to your question, Dahlia, about when does the U.S. government or any actor recognize that things need to change, I mean, somewhat like the Egyptian military, the U.S. government is a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies change very, very slowly. And the U.S. bureaucracy has never been distinguished by its proactive nature or its ability to anticipate and head off crises. Unfortunately, the United States tends to act only once the die has been completely cast. I think Churchill said at one point the United States always does the right thing after they've tried everything else, and I think that remains so up until this point. However, there are individuals within the State Department, within even the White House, that are increasingly skeptical about Egypt's value to the United States, about the trajectory the country is on and how that would influence U.S. interest. In Congress as well, Mohammed, you mentioned that there are some individuals who are increasingly concerned, I think even cynical, about Egyptian behavior. So there is a growing chorus, but ultimately, I don't think it's going to organically emerge and lead to a change of policy. What's more likely is that the Egyptians will cross some line where it becomes impossible to come back. And U.S. policy will only adapt once it's too late, unfortunately. I mean, I hope that's not the case, and I hope we have enlightened leadership that anticipates the crisis and heads it off. But if I'm a betting man and I'm looking and I'm forced to make a gamble as to whether the U.S. government will, unfortunately, I'm probably going to go with the other side just based on the historical record.
Okay, so with regard to the culture of fear, I apologize, in my streamlined discussion I wasn't able to address that. I think this is a palpable concern that figures under consideration are operating in a very insidious political climate. But I think it behooves us to keep in mind that the figures under consideration in Delhi and my book have been around the block. And what I mean by that is that these are figures who had revolving door relationships with Mubarak's prisons. They were scions of championing for democracy and the liberal rule of law under deeply difficult, contentious political terrains, for lack of a better term. The caveat here is that in the aftermath of 2011, and specifically in the context of 2013, these figures, who otherwise had this very acrimonious relationship with the state, had suddenly shifted gears to lend their enthusiastic support to the new order. And in that regard, I think that this is not something we can simply dismiss as a product of their operating in an environment of fear, but it's something far more insidious that really lies at the heart of their political project and the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of it. For more on that, I encourage you all to read our book.
Well, that's a great place to end. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Wonderful discussion on Egypt. We finished on time. We have a coffee break until about 11, and our next panel will be moderated by Dr. Nader Hashmi on Iran and Saudi relations. So thank you so much.
خاموشیش بکنم.
نه اینا رو بگیرم، بریکارم بگیرم.
چرا اینا؟
عکس.
خود از مردم بگیر.